We are about to start it in the next 5 minutes. We would appreciate before the beginning of the session that you put on your cell phones on either silent or switch them off. During the discussion, we would appreciate if you can, if you can observe silence throughout the session. It would help the speakers to actually communicate themselves much more clearly. Secondly, we would ask, the format of the session, the duration of the session is 1 hour long. The format would be, there will be 45 minutes discussion between the speakers out there on the stage. And after that, we would have a 15-minute question and answer session. So, and when the question and answer session begins, we would appreciate if you can keep your questions short and concise and refrain from making any outrageous statements. Thank you.
Any major substantive role in the discussion. What we'll do is this, we are launching this book, The Emergence of Socialist Thought Among North Indian Muslims. And just one word about this book, and this is my own evaluation of the book. And it is that in terms of the details, this is a very rigorous piece of work. It's very well documented. It specifies its sources very well, and it's pretty clear that it is a result of serious hard work. One may have questions about the larger picture that it deals with, the supervening structure of this discussion. But as far as the miniature painting is concerned, if I use a metaphor from visual arts, the miniatures it paints, they are very detailed and very well written. So what we'll do, I will ask Professor Ansari Sahab to give us a synopsis of his thesis and his study, and the groundbreaking conclusions that he has made. After that, I'll ask Babar Sahab to respond, and then I have my own questions. Unless you have burning questions, if you do have burning questions, I'm going to surrender my rights to you. You have priority over me, and then we'll move on that way. Now, let me say one thing finally to you before I pass on the floor to Professor Ansari, and it is that I'm conceiving it as a very interactive session. Interactive sessions. We'll talk. We'll have a conversation. This is not a formal lecture. This is just an exchange. So I think that if even during a presentation you have some very urgent question, you may interrupt, and we'll see if we can entertain that. So please relax. We'll have a very relaxed conversation, and this is just a conversation. So Khizar, Humayun Sahab, over to you.
Nomanul Haq, thank you very much indeed. I suppose first of all, what I would like to say is that it's because of courtesy of OUP that I'm here, and so I must thank the OUP for its invitation and for giving me the opportunity to be here. Forgive me if I speak to my notes, because I really do want to keep it fairly concise and relatively focused. So that's what I'm going to do. Probably speak for maybe 15 to 20 minutes maximum. In republishing really my book, an updated edition, OUP gave me the opportunity to revisit the circumstances in which I originally carried out the research. Just as the Muslims whom I studied existed, operated in a past set of circumstances that helped to form them, just as they were not able to escape the prejudices or perhaps limitations of their culture and age, their perspectives, their concepts and their concerns, I too, a captive of my own times, my historical material and method, like all historians, operated in a context. I too was constrained by attitudes, motives, purposes that collectively shaped my work. Looking at it from the vantage point of 2015, a different time, another world, I feel driven to a different reflection, compelled to present a revised interpretation, at least to some degree, of that past. In 1990, when my study on Muslim socialists in British India was first published, the Berlin Wall had just fallen and the Soviet Union, the citadel of communism, was in meltdown. The Cold War had been won. The triumph of capitalism and of the secular neoliberal ideology seemed complete. At least that is how the world appeared in the West. In Muslim societies around the world, the political landscape was changing too, albeit somewhat differently. Secularism, nationalism, and socialism had not delivered, it was argued, on the promises of social justice and economic prosperity, producing disenchantment among many Muslims with the West. And its presentation of what it assumed were universally progressive ideologies. Muslim states dominated by monarchs and military or ex-military rulers, mostly authoritarian, often unelected, and frequently propped up by Western governments, appeared discredited and lacking legitimacy. Rampant corruption and the palpable disparity between the rich and the poor further deepened the disillusionment with modernization as it failed to solve the problems afflicting these societies. Secularism, increasingly perceived as a legacy of colonialism perpetuated by Western-oriented elites, threatened to supplant cherished religious and cultural identities. And so, in many ways, the process of secular social change was identified as the cause of moral decline and spiritual alienation. There was resentment of Western dominance and exploitation, and of the inability of those in power to resist its political and cultural hegemony. This antagonism, albeit combined with a grudging admiration of Western power in the sense of science and technology, was further fueled by festering memories of Islam as a dominant world power and civilization that had lost out to the godless West. It was in this context of despondency that religio-political Islamic traditions re-emerged as an alternative, offering a self-sufficient ideology for both state and society that would be viewed as most likely to deliver political and socio-economic well-being. With this backdrop in mind, what originally motivated me in the early mid-1980s to write the first edition of this book was my own personal desire to understand the historical background to the ideological transformations that had been taking place in Pakistan since 1947, a period during which it had moved from being a country once projected as a model of Muslim enlightenment to one that was by the 1980s in the throes of state-sponsored Islamization under the dictatorship of Ziaul Haq, General Ziaul Haq. Over the course of the 1970s, I witnessed the devastating civil war and secession of East Pakistan, And in immediate aftermath of that debacle with the military, key pillar of the Pakistani state in disarray, the spontaneous eruption of mass struggles for political power, especially in the big cities, Karachi, Lahore, Faisalabad, seemed very much like the ushering in of a new dawn. But then, given the inchoate character of those struggles, we were confronted with their almost inevitable hijacking by Pakistan's ruling elites as they regained control, sucking out all the energy and power of the masses, rapidly consigning them back to the dust heap. To be honest, in those heady days of 1972, naive utopian romanticism took firm hold of the left. It believed that we were in the midst of a pre-revolutionary situation. With hindsight, we now realize how fantastical that idea now seems. Why had we ended up in such a mess? Under these circumstances, when I began my research, I felt that to understand where we had got to, I needed to examine the historical roots of the crisis. There, I began to realize, probably lay substantially at least in many different ideological and political responses to British rule in the 20th century. So, at the time of writing, I recognized that the two dominant ideological movements among Muslims, the separatist communalists and the composite nationalists, had already been studied almost to the point of exhaustion. However, a third strand, in many ways significant and influential, namely the secularist socialist, had received very little attention. Why this neglect? I was curious. Hence my book, my attempt to write the history of those men and women who devoted the best part of their lives to realizing the vision that this strand offered. The questions that concerned me in particular were twofold. How was it that the liberal socialist opinion had come so utterly marginalized and the religious right so powerfully ascended in the decades since Pakistan's creation? And did this have anything to do with the way that Muslims, and that's a bit of a generalization about Muslims, because which Muslims are we really talking about? Muslims in British India had emerged as engaged with socialist thought and action before independence. These questions concern me because while Islam had certainly never disappeared from public life in Muslim societies, its emergence as a vibrant socio-political force, given the prevailing consensus around the secularization thesis, could not have been confidently predicted. Indeed, it is striking that in the Pakistan's 1970 general election, both Sheikh Mujibur Rahman in East Pakistan and Zulfikar Ali Bhutto in West Pakistan had swept the polls fighting on overwhelmingly secular programs. While it's true that Bhutto later felt compelled to couch his vision in terms of Islamic socialism, when he came to power in what remained of Pakistan in December 1971, as a result of the military debacle and the secession of East Pakistan, he did so on the lack of on the back of mass support in West Pakistan on the ostensibly egalitarian and materialistic slogan of Roti Kapda or Makan. Expectations for the empowerment of hitherto excluded subordinate groups, the emergent middle classes, industrial labor, small landholders, and tenant farmers who had been radicalized in reaction to the Ayub regime's consolidation of the existing power holders were high. Once he had achieved political ascendancy, however, Bhutto found himself hamstrung between fulfilling his populist promises and growing opposition to those from those elites whose interests were being threatened. The resulting ambivalence towards the status quo meant that Bhutto and the PPP faced hostility from the established elites at the same time as disappointing the newly mobilized masses. In order to maintain his hold on power, undoubtedly his primary concern, instead of harnessing the new populist forces to drive his socialist program, he returned to the time-honored parochial politics and co-option of entrenched power holders, combined with placating the religio-political groups who increasingly played on the Islamic sensibility of the masses. Now it's interesting, the secession of East Pakistan, fueled by ethnic nationalism, on the face of it, should have put paid to any lingering notions of Pakistanis comprising a singular nation solely defined by their religion. But on the contrary, it strengthened the hands of those whose goals had always been the establishment of a self-consciously Islamic state. This was arguably because the breakup of the country in 1971 made what remained of it in the West even more vulnerable to further ethnic disintegration, and Islam came to be viewed among those in charge of what remained of the Pakistani state as the only possible glue keeping it together. Though personally a secular man, Bhutto realized that a socialism that did not envisage a role for religion in the public sphere, indeed was antithetical to it, remained largely unacceptable to the vast majority of Pakistanis. He insisted that in his own beliefs and practices he was a servant and a soldier of Islam, and that there was no conflict between socialism and Islam, since the latter had, in fact, given birth to the principles and concepts of socialism. Indeed, for him, socialism was merely the English equivalent of the Arabic Islamic word musawat. But when these pleadings failed to satisfy his opponents, Bhutto steadily moved away from his radical rhetoric, making symbolically important concessions to those demanding the Islamization of the state's legal, social, economic, and political structure. This move towards an overtly Islamic posture was also fueled by Bhutto's concern to break Pakistan's dependency on the West, something that he felt would be possible, at least in part, through forging stronger ties with the so-called Muslim world. In order to restore Pakistani pride after military offered a critique of Western colonialism. Yeah, I could do that, right? So, military humiliation at the hands of India in 1965 and 1971. His focus shifted to West Asia and the Islamic cultural world. The interaction of labor with the Gulf further encouraged the spread of Islamist ideas in Pakistan. Under these circumstances, Bhutto seemed to expect that and one could say arguably opportunistic, catering for Islamic sentiments combined with the ongoing socialist measures would prove sufficient for him to retain the support of ordinary Pakistanis. However, instead of placating the Islamist-led opposition, his approach directly encouraged sectarian militancy and eventually led to the formation of the right-wing coalition, which was able to mobilize sections of the poor who had become disillusioned by the failure of PPP policies to improve their lives, as well as those who felt that their vested interests were under attack from his reforms. The ensuing political crisis of the late 1970s created the circumstances for Bhutto's removal and also the imposition of military dictatorship under General Ziaul Haq. Was ideologically and in practice a man with strong sympathies for the Jamaat-e-Islami's religio-political or Islamist vision of Pakistan that followed protests after the allegedly rigged general elections in 1977. This shift in power from civilian to military hands opened up space for the state-sponsored Islamization of Pakistani society on the one hand, while on the other, even greater and more violent oppression of the left than that to which it had already been subjected by Bhutto himself now took place. Repression of Pakistan's socialists produced a vacuum regarding who or what could address social and economic needs of the masses. Islamism as an alternative ideology not only offered a critique of Western neo-colonialism, but also a means of empowerment and of establishing a just social order. Now, looking at ideological developments in Pakistan from the vantage point of the 21st century, we might get the impression that in the decades since the departure of Z.A. Bhutto, the left in this country has been rendered irrelevant. The consolidation of Zia's Islamization policies between 1977 and 1988 led many to believe that processes of secularization had gone into reverse. Secularist ideologies and socialism in particular were no longer viewed as part of the existing political discourse. Islamism instead gained widespread popular traction. Revivalist tendencies became much more part of the political mainstream. To achieve political advantage, Islamists have, I would say malevolently, certainly critics would suggest, portrayed secularism as the antithesis of religion. In Pakistan, however, secularism, especially since the end of the 1970s, has become largely a maligned concept. Abul Ala Maududi, founder of the Jamaat-e-Islami, termed it as ilhad, atheism, through its definition as la diniyat, a state of being without a religion, or dahriyat, a refusal of religion. Islamists have increasingly projected secularism as the negation and hence enemy of Islam. By ignoring the etymology of the Arabic word from secularism, al-mania, which is derived from the word alam, worldly, or ilmania, relating to the word ilm, science or knowledge, or indeed dunyawiya, temporal, in contrast to dini, religious. Such misrepresentations contributed to its widespread rejection among ordinary Muslims in the 21st century. Indeed, as many of us would appreciate, the relationship between secularization and the politicization of Muslim identity has always been complicated. If we take the colonial era, and my work is primarily to do with that, then what we find is that while maintaining an official distance from religious identities was construed as secularism in the minds of colonial administrators, in reality, religion became a prominent and well-supported feature of public life under the Raj. This resulted from the widespread British assumption that all Indians, irrespective of their individual faith, acted out of an inherent religiosity. Indian communities were consequently categorized and codified according to religious affiliations. Religious laws, political constituencies, and census activity meant that religion emerged as a unified, cohesive, but also manipulated category of identification. In this way, Islam as a category attained a particular political status that it had previously lacked. So while the colonial public sphere, and that's the important and relevant bit for us, was structured in ways that gave religious identities prominence, with religion unable to be privatized, the project of secularization was compromised. The colonial administration's stated policy may have been one of neutrality towards religious belief, but in fact, in practice, this was actively negated. Paradoxically, in the context of a secular state, religious differences were highlighted and utilized. In addition, understanding the impact of the colonial period also required attention to be paid to processes at work within Indian communities themselves. Official policy, the complications of mainstream nationalism that freely borrowed ideological symbols of Hindu revilist politics and competition with different ranks of the Hindu community over the restricted resources available to Indians all provided additional stimulus for popularizing political Islam. This political Islam, however, presented a certain kind of modernity, which, while distinct in content and form, shared many of mainstream modernity's conceptual presumptions. Islamism was modern, within quotes, in terms of its strategies of communication and organization, and it was modern in its application of science and technology. It brought an end to the unquestionable and unquestioned authority of the past, as Muslims sought new ways of making revelation and tradition relevant to the present. There was recognition of human will as a decisive factor in the regaining of political power. So, the authority of and interpretations of the ulama was questioned, but in its place, the idea of this worldly Islam was certainly something that was very much accepted. Within these processes of rationalization were embedded the seeds of secularization. These inevitably from time to time led some Muslims to break away from the bounds of community to embrace the world of unbelief and other ideologies that lay beyond. Muslims who willed their religion made their own choices. The more they did so, the more they affirmed their own autonomy, their own individuality. Once individual Muslims moved down this path, there was always the possibility that they would choose to express their identity by choosing not to believe at all. Hence, in the later years of British rule, as my book set out to explore, such Muslims often held secular views as progressive writers, socialists, or communists. Among them, there were women concerned to raise and discuss in public issues that Muslims had traditionally kept hidden. All of them, perhaps unquestioningly, accepted a dichotomy between universal, rational, and democratic definitions of the secular and the particular, irrational, undemocratic, and intolerant core of the religious. I mean, just to sort of highlight this, what I'm talking about is a very wide range of people who were animated by what I would call the socialist, secular, to some certain extent vision, but not necessarily always so. I'm really talking about the egalitarianism that became paramount in their thinking. So if one could I just show 3 sets of people who were involved in some of these movements? The next one, please. Okay, here we have 3. No, yeah, that's right. Here we have 3 early socialists from the 1917 onwards. Maulana Hasrat Mohani, who actually was one of the founders of the Communist Party of India. He called himself a Muslim socialist, communist. Then we have 2 of the pan-Islamist revolutionary nationalists who engaged with the Bolshevik revolution in a very, very significant way. Maulana Barkatullah Bhopali, who called Lenin his brother, and who constantly referred to the gains that the Bolshevik revolution, an earth-shattering event that had taken place. And Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was also there, together with Maulana Barkatullah Bhopali, met Lenin and was part of the movement that actually began with them and Roy and the founding of the Communist Party of India in 1920 in Tashkent. They were also together with people who went as part of the Muhajirin movement in 1920, well, actually earlier, but certainly in 1920, and then through Kabul and Tashkent, finally arrived in Moscow, where they were educated in the University of the Toilers of the East. So this is the first group of people that I was looking at, and their contribution is absolutely immense. Could we show the next group, please? And then, certainly from the 1930s onwards, we are really talking about people in the progressive writers movement. On the one hand, we had Sajjad Zahir, who was at the beginning of this movement. Then we have Sibte Hassan, who stayed in Pakistan once having migrated here. And then certainly Faiz Ahmed Faiz, who was very prominent in the movement from the late 1930s onwards. So we have these stalwarts who became part of the socialist liberal progressive movement from the 1930s onwards. And within that, could I show the third lot? Because I think sometimes it's forgotten that really there were some very, very powerful forces from among the women themselves as well. And the three that I highlight there are Rashid Jahan, the bad girl of literature, one of the four contributors to that historic collection of short stories, Angare. And then we have Asmat Chuktai, her famous works of Teri Lakir and Lihaf about lesbian relationships. And then we have Quratul Ain Haider, certainly her work Aag Ka Darya and Aakhir Shab Ke Humsafar and Kare Jahan Daraz Hai, or Kare, those are some of them, just three of the main figures who were involved in that particular struggle. So we're talking about these Muslims who gravitated towards the secularist ideologies such as socialism. It could be argued that they did not adequately recognize the deeply modernizing reconstruction of Islam that was already taking place during the colonial times. So pre-40 secularist Muslim socialists in South Asia, through this arguably partial reading of Marx, tended to dismiss religious belief as false consciousness. So I'm sort of in a sense thinking about more recently the way that we are looking at religion. And there is a selective partial reading of Marx that probably didn't do socialists much justice. So we're talking about false consciousness, a palliative, a psychological and cultural balm, assuaging painful human experience. For them, religion was simply the ideological expression of the powerful legitimating hierarchy. And they were talking about a tool of the privileged class to strengthen their control. The march of history meant accelerating secularization and creating for them a future in which religion would cease to exist, or at least be of no importance once man was able to, and women one would have thought, was able to engage rationally with all human needs without recourse to religious dogma. This is the way that they were arguing. But what they failed to do, and here my study explores why, was to fully engage with the intricacy of Marx's understandings of religion. Crucially, they ignored that he also recognized in religion an active moral agency, especially for the degraded and the despised. The essence of religion was its voicing and passionate suffering, its cry against the realities of exploitation and degradation. Likewise, the essence of being human was the struggle for humanity to take back into its own hands a world that it had made, but which it has been taken away from it. This is what Marx was actually, in a sense, trying to get across, and there is a subtlety there in the way that he was actually doing that, which wasn't fully grasped necessarily in that particular period. Religious suffering and this is again from Marx in an off-quoted comment by Marx, it says, is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against a real suffering. Religion, he says, is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of soulless conditions. So this is the way that he was thinking about it, not just purely in terms as false consciousness, but much, much more deeply. It is this recognition of the continuing depth of the religious dimension in human life and the close connection between religion and politics within human affairs, in particular the moral and ethical components and the commitments combined with the social activism and welfare community interventions of the Islamists in social life, that secularly inclined Muslim socialists, whether in colonial India, which is the focus of my book, in post-1947 Pakistan, or even perhaps in Muslim societies more broadly, seem to have failed to incorporate sufficiently, they have, sufficiently is the key word here, into their consciousness and political understanding. From the perspective of the present, it is in the limitations imposed by this understanding of the human condition that we can perhaps glimpse a possible explanation for, and I've got, when I say failure, quotations mark around it, because really I'm not sure whether this is necessarily, this word failure is the most accurate descriptor of their experience of or what they were able to do. I think that one needs to actually look at it in a much more cogent way. And I don't necessarily consider it a failure myself either. But certainly from an outside perspective, it feels a little bit like that. So the failure of these people and their strategies, while also crediting them with leaving an important collective legacy for the history of and the people from this part of the world. So really, that's what I've been talking about in
Yes, well, thank you very much. I'm very, very, very sorry, but we are left with less than 15 minutes. So we have to adjust accordingly, and I've just been told that we'll be thrown out of this room exactly at 6. The organizers are very adamant about it. Now, I'm going to request Babar Ayaz Sahab to be as brief as possible, because I want to open the floor to you, and whatever has been said, I think, is highly provocative in a happy sense, that it raises many questions, it generates a discussion, and I have numerous questions, but I think we'll just wait and see how it goes. So, Babar Sahab, please, briefly, very briefly.
Thank you, Dr. Haq. I don't think I will go much in detail, because what I wanted to say, I will hold it back. I will just go directly to the questions which came to my mind while reading the book. One aspect was that when Khizar was trying to trace the socialist thought in the particular period, obviously it is a history research book, so it is limited to a particular time frame. And in that time frame, when he's talking about thought, so he devotes a lengthy chapter on the Pakistan progressive writers. So that is something which comes to my mind, and I have always pondered on this, that somehow the leadership and the thought process of in the subcontinent, even in Pakistan and Communist Party of Pakistan and all, it's the writers, the literature writers, who became too important. And in the political thought, whatever little work was done from a Marxist perspective on the economic side or on the sociology side or political depth in the political science way, and an analysis of the society, was very little done, and whatever was done by some of the scholars who actually were teaching abroad. So in the whole book,
Yes.
what it comes to my mind that I don't find that you are talking about any economic thesis which came regarding India, which should have been a primary thing as a Marxist, because Marxism is not literature only, and also on the understanding the sociology of India, so that proper, this is one, and then my follow-up question will come to that.
Okay, briefly, yes.
Yeah. Well, just very briefly, and I think what we need to kind of understand is the context in which these socialists were operating. So in 1917, we find that, as I was saying earlier, an earth-shattering event had actually taken place, where it changed the whole configuration of what was happening around the country. An overturning of a whole system had actually happened. So it was very, very powerful. Its impact was very, very powerful. And so because it was successful, it was thought that we have to take our lead from the Soviet Union. If they'd got it right, then the sorts of strategies that they were following, the kinds of political and economic programs that they had in mind, would be the ones that would actually bring us success in India as well. So that's the context that we are looking at. If one sort of takes a little bit further, what we find is that generally speaking, Marxists, socialists, and so around the globe had already sort of accepted, if you like, the truth of Marx's writings. In the Communist Manifesto, the business of class struggle that's there. Das Kapital, the economic sort of perspective is there. So again, very rationally that was around. And then certainly when Lenin talks about state and revolution or imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, that's also taken on board because it had actually delivered very positive results in the Soviet Union. So that was one reason. The other, very briefly, was that certainly with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union very much leading the sort of, if you like, global struggle in terms of revolution, then was in a sense able.
So does that mean that
I just want to finish on that. So what you find is that basically those ideas came to India. And they were to a certain extent led by the Communist International, of which the
you had mentioned in your book that mostly the party initial time, M.N. Roy was controlling from Moscow, and then funded was also coming, which I was looking the sources, and I saw that you have given the source, that how many dollars in that time were given and how many pounds were given and all that. So should I take it that when we were taking the funding, we were living by the, say the second or the third Communist International, Comintern and all that, we were just importing the whole thought process without realizing the kind of a society we are living in. So it is actually anti-Marxist view of doing things. And as a result, does that mean that that is the result, that the day the Soviet Union socialist system collapsed, we all collapsed?
Yes, I think this is a very, very important question that you have raised, and let me make a few observations very quickly and ask the audience to see if they want to participate in the discussion during the few minutes that we have. One is that there are a few points that come out of this the presentation of Ansari Sahab. One is that the rise of Islamism is a result of a despondency, right? Disillusionment. Now, this is a circumstantial explanation, not a doctrinal explanation. We don't know what's wrong with the doctrine, but there were circumstances according to which Islamism had to some ideology had to replace the existing ideology. So that is one point. The other thing is that people in Pakistan didn't understand Marxism, right? Especially with regard to his position with religion. People did not understand. This is the second thing he says. The third thing he says that they did not understand what secularism is. He talks about the etymology. I don't know if Arabic morphology would allow the extraction of the word Almania from Ain Lam Mim. I don't think it will happen. But anyway, that is your position. And the final thing, which I say it in order to provoke questions from you, is that socialism is irrelevant in Pakistan today. Now, open to you.
Thank you for that. I had a question specifically about sort of the emergence of Bolshevism and how it's, what the response amongst North Indian Muslims is. So what is the reaction to Trotsky, and how influential is Trotsky's work, aside from Lenin, and how do the North Indian Muslims respond to the Lenin-Trotsky split later on that arises, right? Because Trotsky's work really becomes the underlying sort of ideological motivation behind Bolshevism initially, right?
This is, yeah, please do, briefly, so that we have some more questions.
Yeah, very briefly, what we are talking about is that quite clearly Trotsky was one of the leaders of the revolution alongside Lenin and Stalin. What, in a sense, happens after the Bolshevik Revolution is that broadly, the Bolsheviks were very clear in their minds that unless the revolution, in fact, spreads, particularly to the industrialized West, it was going to actually be lost. So when that didn't happen, I mean, we had defeats in Germany, certainly a very, very big one in 1920 period. There were huge sort of issues that came up in the Soviet Union itself. So what you find is that basically from that point onwards, it was a question of how to sustain the revolution within the Soviet Union. And the theory that was applied was socialism in one country. And that's the way that Stalin, if you like, the head of the Communist Party, Secretary General, and so on, pursued that. And in order for him to pursue that, then he had to actually carry out a huge amount of repression, and we know all about that. So that was the problem, really. And Trotsky was constantly hammering away at this idea that you've got to actually move the revolution on to a much wider canvas. And if you're not going to be able to do that, then there is no way that that revolution is going to be able to be sustained.
Questions, quickly. We have like 5 minutes. Please be very brief.
I had two questions. The first one was, do you think mainstream socialist thought has died in Pakistan with Zia's Islamization? And the second question was, do you think Islam and secularism fundamentally are mutually exclusive?
Yeah, this is a question to you.
This is a question to me.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm just, I think that if one is thinking about the socialist vision, what are we talking about? We are talking about an egalitarian society. We are talking about equality. We are talking about liberty. All those things that are part of modernity. And in that sense, I don't think that socialism is irrelevant at all. I think it's very, very much part of people's sort of ideas, hopes, for the future. So certainly on that particular level, I don't think it's safe. How do we actually move forward is something that is a challenge for us all. Yeah. So that's the first thing. The second is that initially the first set of images there were to do with Maulana Hasrat Mohani, Maulana Barkatullah Bhopali. We were talking about Ubaidullah Sindhi.
Yes.
Now, all these people very categorically asserted that they were Muslims. There was no doubt in their mind that they were Muslims. Theologically, that in terms of the belief, that might have been the case. But in terms of their political strategies, in terms of their understanding of the world, they were very much socialists. That's what they said very clearly. So, if you're saying, well, is there this dichotomy? Not necessarily. But I don't think that one needs to... So one can actually see the convergence there in some way. But I think that what we have to understand is that in terms of modernity, if one looks at the public sphere, then what role does organized religion actually play?
Yes.
How it's actually pursued is something that, of course, is questionable.
Let me repeat this, that some of the fathers of socialist thoughts in India, they have been madrasa educated people. Hasrat Mohani, Ubaidullah Sindhi, those who were struggling for Western style education, they themselves did not know English. Sir Sayyid did not know English. Hali did not know English. In fact, he regretted that he did not know English. Maulana Azad did not know English, and they were very, very strong in the Aligarh movement. So this, habit of binary thinking, Islam or secularism, this is a very complex question and has to be re-understood. And these are facts. Those who did not know English were favoring Western education, having no exposure to Western education. Now, I'm ready to take other questions. We have like 3 minutes, perhaps. Please, yes.
What, 8 minutes? I think.
No, 3 minutes. Yes. Yes.
Do you think this NGOism is revival of socialism or death of socialism?
I don't know. Babar Sahib, can you sort of enlighten us?
You have to say something, yes. Can we give the microphone there? Yes.
Any comment you can give on the National Awami Party, the forerunner to ANP, which was the Bacha Khan movement in the frontier? And this is relating to the period that you're talking about.
Bacha Khan movement.
The movement of Bacha Khan was, do you not recognize that as being influenced by socialist thought?
Very briefly, Bacha Khan, we are talking about red shirts, we are talking about, he was actually called the frontier Gandhi, wasn't he? So he was very, very close to the Indian National Congress right the way through. There's no doubt about that. And he had very close relations with with Mahatma Gandhi at that time. But what I think we need to be very clear about is, so he had a pretty secular perspective, so as did the Indian National Congress. And if one looks at the Indian National Congress, then clearly there was some, it had a range of positions, going from right-wing Hindu-dominated nationalism to, in fact, the Congress Socialist Party, which was very, very close to many of the other strands. So certainly one can say that in the Northwest Frontier province at the time, there was this very strong movement, and it mobilized lots of people, and so it was possible for that kind of sort of thinking to go forward politically.
Yeah. Before I take the question, I want to request particularly Sir Ansari Sahab. Sir Ansari Sahab, मुझे आपसे पूछना है कि ये बात जो अभी कही गई कि सोशलिस्ट फिक्र की कोई जगह पर ही नहीं अदब में, मसलन आप जरा सा अगर कुछ कह दें इस बारे में, इस सवाल के बाद. Let's have the question first, जी.
यहाँ दें माइक. अंसारी साहब.
अंसारी साहब. उसके बाद जरा उनसे पहले आप सवाल कर लीजिए. After you
पूछना चाहता हूँ कि दोस्त ने जो है कम्युनिस्ट थॉट इंडियन मूवमेंट के हवाले से या मुस्लिम उसके हवाले से जो बात की, लेकिन उसने जो बलूचिस्तान को नज़रअंदाज किया. बलूचिस्तान में जो है कम्युनिस्ट मूवमेंट क्यों नज़रअंदाज किया गया? क्या स्कॉलर की जो गिरफ्त इतनी कमज़ोर थी, जबकि मौलाना उबैदुल्ला सिंधी को जो यहाँ से ले गए, वो बलोच कम्युनिस्ट दोस्तों ने लेकर वहाँ गए. वहाँ लेनिन से उनसे स्टालिन से मुलाकात हुई. 1920 में जो बाको कॉन्फ्रेंस हुआ था, वहाँ बलोच कम्युनिस्टों ने जो है वहाँ जो है शिरकत की थी. बलूचिस्तान के दो हिस्से थे. एक हिस्सा जो है ब्रिटिश बलूचिस्तान के हवाले से जो इंडिया के माते था, तो वहाँ, और इसके अलावा जो है ये जंग अजीम के दौरान जो है बलोच कम्युनिस्टों ने, बल्कि कम्युनिस्ट पार्टी के हवाले से काजी दाद मोहम्मद अली जी,
मैं आपका सवाल आ
लोगों ने जो है
जी, आपका सवाल आ गया, जवाब लीजिए. मुख्तसर एक जुमला.
उसमें यही है कि अगर आप मेरे किताब का पहला चैप्टर देखें तो उसमें आपको ये नज़र आएगा कि वो महाजरीन की जो एक मूवमेंट थी, जिसका आपने अभी हवाला दिया है, उबैदुल्ला सिंधी काबुल में जो बैठे जाकर, उसके अंदर ये तमाम बातें जो इनका जिक्र आया है. तकरीबन 20,000 जो यहाँ से थे महाजरीन, वो उस मूवमेंट के ज़रिए से काबुल तक पहुँचे. वहाँ पर प्रोविजनल गवर्नमेंट ऑफ इंडिया बनी, جس کا جو مطلب یعنی کہ ان کا ایم تھا کہ وہ فریڈم اسٹرگل جو ہے اس کو انڈیا میں قائم کریں. تو جو عبید اللہ سندھی کی جو آپ بات کر رہے ہیں ان کے جو 7 لوگ گئے تھے ان کا میں نے ذکر کیا ہے اپنی پہلے چیپٹر کے اندر, وہ آپ دیکھیں.
جی سیر انصاری صاحب ایک جملہ. جی
بس میں سمجھتا ہوں کہ چونکہ یہ پوری اسٹڈی جو ہے وہ 1947 تک محدود رکھی گئی ہے, اس لیے اس سے پہلے کے جو حالات ہیں ان کے بارے میں تو یہی کہا جا سکتا ہے کہ جس طرح سے یہ نارتھ انڈیا میں آیا تو صرف مسلمانوں ہی میں یہ نہیں بلکہ اس وقت کے ہندوؤں نے, سکھوں نے بھی بہت اہم کردار ادا کیا اس میں, اور اس سے ایک جو مجموعی فضا بنی اس سے ترقی پسند تحریک کی جو آغاز ہوا اس میں آپ دیکھیں گے کہ سبھی اس میں شامل تھے. لہٰذا یہ کہ الگ سے اگر ہم اس کو کریں گے تو کوئی میرا خیال ہے کہ زیادہ بہتر نتائج نہیں نکلیں گے. اور ایک بات جو میں عرض کرنا چاہتا تھا کہ سیکولرزم کو جو ہے لادینیت بھی کہا گیا اور الحاد وغیرہ بھی, لیکن میں نے اپنی حد تک جو ہے اس کا ترجمہ ہمادینیت کیا ہے, اس لیے کہ وہ جو اب پرانا سیکولرزم کا تصور جو کرسچینٹی اور جوڈائزم سے شروع ہوا تھا وہ اس زمانے کے لیے ویلڈ نہیں ہے. یہاں تو مقصد یہ ہے کہ آپ ہر ایک کو رائٹ آف ایکسپریشن اور لکھنے پڑھنے کی آزادی, سوچنے کی آزادی, جمہوریت یہ دیں, اس سے پھر ظاہر ہے کہ سیکولر روایتیں قائم ہو سکتی ہیں.
Babar, Ayaz Sahab had something to say and we'll let him have the final word.
Just 2 points. One, in the overall discussion, it seems that the impression came out that the secular forces are very weak. They may be weak in expression, but in the country like Pakistan, I think by and large people are secular. The Islamism and Islamist movements look stronger because they have the bomb blastings and the guns, and they can create more noise and nuisance to the society. 1. 2, socialism, as you also said, cannot be taken, maybe socialist revolution is not in sight at all, as we were told when we were young communists and used to work, that it's knocking at our door, it's no more. So socialist revolution is not in sight because it's not a revolutionary situation. But on the greater plane, as I think Dr. Saab and other people also explained, the thing is that greater good of the greater number of people is incrementally happening and will continue to happen, and people will strive for their rights, whether in different forms, they do it every day. So that is something which we have to take into account, that it will be an incremental change towards what socialism ideals were, that is greater good of the greater number of people. Thank you.
Well, this is a happy note, and I think we can end at happy note. Thank you very much, Ansari Sahab, Ayaz Sahab, and this wonderful audience. Thank you.